Hello everyone and welcome back to another Kerbal Space Program video. And in today's Kerbal Space Program video, we're going to be doing something that I've had requested quite a lot over the years, but I've never really thought of a good way of presenting it. And then I had an idea of how to execute it using the somewhat new robotic parts from the Breaking Ground DLC. Now the request I'm talking about is the request of, can you make a space station that can travel the solar system, dock, or not dock, but stop off at various planets, do whatever space stations do in their natural habitat, and then move on. I thought, it's kind of an interesting concept, but I've done things like single stage to anywhere craft that have labs and stuff on board, so I feel like I've kind of already done that. But then I had an idea. One of the reasons why the single stage to anywhere craft probably isn't considered by people who request this concept of a space station that can move is because it doesn't really look like a space station, right? It's just an aircraft with a lab on board. Space stations, to me at least, in terms of how we know them in our current age of, things like the ISS, the Mir station, that sort of thing, with the big arms, with big solar panels on the engines, you know what I mean? That space station-y look. That's what I think a lot of people think of when they think of a space station, and that's kind of probably what they mean when they say, can you make a space station that can move around? So that's what I'm going to try and do in this video. A craft that looks like a space station in that it's all kind of expansive and unfoldy with big solar panel arrays, that sort of thing, but it can move around. And I thought to make things a little bit trickier for myself and to make the video ultimately a little bit more interesting, we'll package it up into the form factor of an SSTO. Because this is kind of a thing I had a vague idea for this sort of craft for a while, in that what if we built a space station inside the cargo bay of an SSTO, and then the craft can go up into space, unfold itself robotically, become a space station, do its mission or whatever, and then it can repack itself into the cargo bay all automatically and then land, and then you can just deploy the mission over and over and over again. Because I feel like in the real world that could have quite useful kind of uses. I feel like if we had the technology to do SSTOs, that would be something that would be done, is a rapid deployment space station research lab, that sort of thing. Like say, hey, we want to get this into space, see how this new material acts or something like that. Let's quickly try it. Whack it in the space station craft and off we go. And also, you can make sure all the equipment is well maintained, easily and cleaned and all that, and you can cycle the crew much more easily than having to do lots of resupply missions. You can just bring the whole thing back and then send it all out again, which, now I say it out loud, probably doesn't sound quite as practical as just having a fixed station up in orbit. You can do less expensive missions to and from it, but hey, this is a fully reusable craft. The only thing we're paying for is fuel. And Lowne Aerospace, we're a very rich company. Our theme park business really brings in a lot of income. So we can afford the fuel expenditure to repeatedly put the space station in orbit and bring it back again. So, as you can see, I've gone with the essentials for a Kerbal space station. We have the lab module, obviously. We have an observatory that extends out on that big telescoping piston. We have a big solar panel array. We have radiators. Well, I think we will have radiators. I don't see them on the screen at the moment, so I've not added them just yet, but we will. We will. Communications dishes, every single piece of scientific equipment, and ladders as well to connect the observatory to the science lab, because whilst it would make sense that a Kerbal could transfer internally between the cockpit of the spaceplane and the lab, doesn't really make sense because they can't. That telescoping cylinder probably doesn't look like it has the internal capacity to accommodate a Kerbal ascending it, so the Kerbals will have to do an EVA to get to that observatory at the top. So I've added those ladders there just to help facilitate that, really. What I originally wanted was to have a bit more built into that hinge system, so the actual lab itself wouldn't remain inside the cargo bay. That too would extend outwards on pistons, but the problem is, because this thing is meant to ascend through the atmosphere in a space plane and then re-enter, the hinges, they get a bit glitchy and the thing starts oscillating too much inside the cargo bay and the lab just sort of falls out. It's hard to explain, but I tried a lot and it just wouldn't work. It wasn't secure enough in its cargo bay. The lab is just too heavy for those big hinges, unfortunately. So that's why it's only really the lightweight parts of the station that can actually unfold and extend out. But nonetheless, I still think it looks pretty good. I haven't shown you it unfolded in the spaceplane hangar just yet because obviously I think it looks much more impressive when it's out in space. So you guys have got a lot to look forward to. Watch this video all the way to the end. Of course, that's a thing that people say, so it must mean something. Now we're just going to construct the rest of the SSTO, which is fairly similar to how I build my Argus class SSTOs, which is just the name I give to my Mark III fuselages, because I'm pretentious like that, and I have names for different styles of spaceplane design that I make, and this particular layout for an SSTO is typical of what I call the Argus class, or in fact it could be more reminiscent of the Besant class, but then again that is a subdivision of the Argus class. So there's so much lore in my head canon that I probably should try and write all this down. Either way, it's a fairly simple setup. Just a few, I think there are 8 rapiers. I think 5, 6, 7, 8. Oh, no, there's actually more than 8 rapiers. There's 5. There's 11. There's 11 rapiers. Yeah, quick maths, except not quick at all. There are 11 rapiers on this thing. I hope there are. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Good. I didn't want to just start confidently saying 11 rapiers and then realize I'd miscounted. It's hard to watch the footage. It's hard to check carefully in Sony Vegas because the quality I'm seeing on the playback screen is not very good, because otherwise the frame rate would be too slow if it was rendering it at full quality in the preview window, and the preview window itself is very small. So I've got a lot of restrictions to work with that I'm not quite sure why this is relevant to you guys, because you guys are watching the hopefully fully rendered 1080p 60 FPS the finished version of this video. I don't know what this is. Let's move along. The main space plane is actually completely finished now, to be honest. We've got the landing gear there. We have a docking port on the front of the space plane as well. And that is not just there for, I usually put the docking port on the front of the space shuttle style cockpit. I really should learn the names of the parts in this game. I just say things like the space shuttle style cockpit, the Apollo style command pod. I should probably get it right. This is just the Mark III space plane cockpit, right? So I guess it's a fairly easy one to remember. So I probably should start trying a little bit harder to name things correctly. But like I say, there is a docking port on the front of that cockpit, and it's not just there for the aesthetics or, the theoretical enhanced practicality of it, because I often do put a shielded docking port there. But this time I wanted to actually make some practical use of it that does not involve this thing docking to a space station. We're going to fade across now to here's a little thing I made earlier. A small truck and an ominous-looking trailer are parked next to one of the buildings. Is that the administration building? Regardless, it's where the car park is in the Kerbal Space Center. So, you guys can have a little think about what the purpose of that truck might be. It's probably not that difficult to postulate what it might be there for, but I'm going to try and keep the suspense regardless. We're now going to head our way into space. Now, I actually realise I've not done a large SSTO for a while. I say large with some hesitance, because these days some people make pretty crazily sized SSTOs, and I myself have made SSTOs much, much bigger than this one. But I would consider this size of SSTO to be fairly big, and I've not flown one of this sort of size for a while, so I can talk a little bit about the ascent profile I use if you're new to flying single stage to orbit space planes. So the first thing I'm going to do is maintain a fairly flat trajectory, fairly close to sea level where there's lots of oxygen in the air, just until we reach about 440 meters per second. In fact, I'm descending very slightly as well here, just to help pick up that speed. We're using Rapier engines, which don't reach their maximum thrust until they are going faster than the speed of sound. They just don't function quite as effectively. Once you pass about 440 meters per second in this game, they then start providing lots and lots of thrust. As you can see, our surface velocity is now rapidly shooting up, so we can point ourselves at a fairly shallow angle of attack, just to try and strike that balance between gaining altitude at a sufficient pace, but also ensuring that we can continue accelerating adequately. And then once we reach about 10 kilometers, we're going to start pointing even flatter between 0 and 10 degrees on the nav ball, just to try and get as much speed out of the efficient air-breathing mode of the Rapier engines as possible. This is the most efficient part of the mission. After this, we're going to have to rely on chemical rocket engines, which are far less efficient than engines that can rely on intake air. Anyway, now we've passed the 20 kilometer mark, I'm going to fire up the nuclear engines just to help supplement the rapidly decreasing thrust of the Rapier engines. And then once the thrust gets too insufficient, we can hit Action Group 2 to fire them into closed cycle mode, which means they're now going to start using up oxidizer very, very quickly. In fact, they've now used up all the oxidizer. They become much, much less efficient engines when burning in closed cycle mode, those Rapiers. So we have to be make sure we do most of the burn into orbit using them in air breathing mode, and of course using the nuclear engines. The oxidizer burning phase of the Rapier engines is very important because you need that kick to get yourself adequately fast and high enough to reach orbit, but we don't want to spend too much time in that kind of mode of flight because we'll be just too inefficient. So now we've cleared the best part of the atmosphere, the thickest parts of the atmosphere, the most substantial parts of the atmosphere. We can easily make it into orbit using the less powerful nuclear engines. And there we are. We're nearly passing the line that marks the border between the atmosphere and space. There we are, 70 kilometers. We're not quite home just yet. Well, that's probably the wrong word, isn't it? We're not quite in space just yet. We're not quite far at the furthest point from home just yet because we are not orbital. If we don't circularize, we're going to end up hitting the atmosphere and, not achieving our mission. We don't even get to unfold the space station. But that's all, what would have theoretically happened if I hadn't circularized, but I did. So it didn't. And there we are. Now it's time to get to the part that you guys have probably all been waiting for. We're going to deploy the space station. So the first thing I'm going to do is undock those little junior docking ports that are kind of holding the thing together, just to kind of add some rigidity during the flight. I did bind them to Action Group 4. That should have theoretically automatically undocked them, but for some reason it didn't work. So I had to do it manually, and then we can deploy this structure. And there it is. So those solar panels have to be at that kind of weird offset angle just because when they fold up, they are, right next to each other. So if they're along the same plane, they would just clip into each other, which I think would still work. They wouldn't break or anything, but it's a bit unrealistic if we're going to try and make this. I say this is not a very realistic craft, is it? But I feel like if we had the technology today, this would be something that NASA would at least think about doing. And there it is, all unfolded, nice and nicely. Now we're going to get Bill Kerman. I think I was meant to choose Bob because he's the scientist, but I misclicked. So we've got Bill instead. He's the engineer. He's going to EVA up to the ladder. He's not using the ladder to its full extent, but, he likes to live life at the edge. He likes to make use of his EVA pack whenever he can. Yeah, he can't observe the materials bay from the ladder because he ain't no scientist, but regardless, he can sit in the observatory and admire that beautiful shot of the Mun. Wow, look at it, hanging there so serenely. And Bill starts to wonder, we're doing all these experiments in low Kerbin orbit, but, we're very, very close to Kerbin, and we've been here before, many, many times. I wonder if these experiments would yield different results or, more significant results if we were closer to the Mun. There's some food for thought from Bill there. Anyway, Bob Kerbin is going to actually do the mission that we came here to do, which is do some science from low Kerbin orbit. We're going to observe the materials bay. This is obviously on my science save where I've unlocked everything, so we don't get much science from the experiments, but we get a little bit nonetheless, and it's all, adds to, apparently that's what people consider, when you unlock the tech tree, all science you unlock after that adds to your, in air quotes, score. And I often don't even save the science from my missions when I do these videos. I don't bother taking in the data from the experiments. Maybe I should, and just work towards getting a big score. Maybe for like Lowne Aerospace 3, the third one, whenever the next DLC comes out, is probably when I'll reboot my space program. Maybe I'll start doing that. The road to 1 million science points or something like that. I don't know how difficult that would be. I don't want to start giving myself fairly masochistic goals to aim for. Anyway, we have now pretty much done the mission that we came here to do in low Kerbin orbit. We've gathered our science. We've got lots of great observations from the observation pod, or observatory, as most people who speak English would call it. So now we're going to prepare to re-enter the atmosphere. So I've created a maneuver node to get ourselves on a deorbital trajectory that gets us near the Space Center runway. Well, to the Space Center runway, I hope. And then obviously we can pack everything up together before we initiate that deorbit burn, because this thing probably would get a bit wobbly. It might be slightly structurally compromised if we start using our thrusters whilst we have that entire station array deployed. I'm going to fold it all up and then get ready to deorbit with those nuclear engines there. Now, I didn't do a very good job. I made the maneuver node and for some reason forgot that planets rotate. Not just in this game, but in general, I guess. So I didn't think that actually that maneuver node is not going to be how I want it to be when I get to that maneuver node, because the planet will have rotated. So I didn't get a very good descent trajectory, although I did manage to correct it to a somewhat acceptable level just then by doing a quick prograde burn. And there we are. All our Kerbals are back in the safety of the space shuttle cockpit. Again, space shuttle style cockpit. We can prepare to re-enter the atmosphere and initiate atmospheric flight so we can enable all of the control surfaces once again. And I pumped some of the fuel towards the back of the craft just because our center of mass is a little bit too far forward. Normally with these missions I deploy the stuff that's in the cargo bay so this plane is well balanced upon re-entry. I didn't do that in this case obviously because there is no way of emptying the cargo bay, so our center of mass was a little bit too far forward. If we were to leave the fuel pumped all the way at the front in those anterior tanks, we'd probably be a little bit too nose heavy. I mean, we could probably do it. I mean, when I did the test flights with this craft, to be fair, I noticed it was very nose heavy, but it still worked. I thought, I want to get this video done. I don't want to make any mistakes. I'll just try and make the thing a little bit easier to fly by pumping the fuel towards the posterior tanks. And there's the Space Center runway looming ahead. So we're probably going to undershoot it a little bit, but we have lots and lots of liquid fuel, nearly 6,000 units of liquid fuel left. The reason for this is because, well, I said at the beginning that a lot of people request a space station that can travel the solar system. If we only had the fuel to get to low carbon orbit, I wouldn't class that as a space station that can travel the solar system. So I added lots of extra delta V to the orbital stage of this craft in terms of, having more excessive amounts of liquid fuel just so we can go to other planets. Like, I'm pretty sure it could get to every planet in the game. We wouldn't be able to do a landing on every planet in the game, but I think, well, how was it, like 3,200 meters per second? So that can do a flyby of any planet in the Kerbin system. Granted, places like Elu and Moho would be challenging, but with gravity assists, it's possible. So I'm happy that this has fulfilled the request of being able to traverse the solar system. But I feel like I've not done a very good job in showcasing that, right? We've only been to low Kerbin orbit. And Bill, he raised a good point. The Mun would probably have been a much more exciting destination. If only there was some way of putting this space station back into space, and then we can take it somewhere else. Wait a second. That was the whole point of this mission, was it not? That we can land the space station, assess the science that we gathered, refuel the plane, and then send it off on another mission? And that's all we can do. That's why I teased this truck at the beginning. We can get it all docked to the trailer, which contains enough fuel inside it to fully refuel the space plane, and then we can go straight back into orbit, this time heading to the Mun, and repeat our experiments using the same experimental units as well. So we can see, for example, the mystery goo. It is, by its name, a very mysterious substance. We've taken it to low Kerbin orbit. We've seen how it reacts. We can now see how it reacts back on Kerbin, and then we can take it back into space to another celestial body, see how the goo likes going to and from space that many times. There's many, many things we can do with a spacecraft like this. Not at the moment. It's not got enough fuel, hence why we are doing this refueling mission just here. And we can also use this truck to move the space plane back to the other end of the runway so it has enough room to take off once again, because it's beyond the halfway point of the runway. It hasn't got enough room now to take off without smashing into the sea. So we can use the truck as well to shunt it back towards a starting point at the other end of the runway. So we can open up the shielded docking port on the front of the space plane, and then we can open up the shielded docking port on the back of this truck, and we can back it up nice and slowly. Now, the truck's docking port is a little bit too low for the space plane. I did think about articulating the docking port on the truck with the hinges, but I thought it might make things a little bit unnecessarily complicated. I always find you want to try and keep things as simple as possible, and just in general, but especially in this game. So I thought rather than faffing around with hinges and robotic parts, we'll just change the spring strength. That was weird. That was really difficult to say. The spring strength of that front landing gear on the space plane, and we can make it to sort of kneel down to be the correct height to line up with the docking port on the truck. And as you can see, the craft are now docked together. We can initiate the fuel transfer. I'm not going to show the entirety of the fuel transfer because, well, for things like most of the big liquid fuel tanks, it's a fairly quick process. So I can show this at very, very sped up speeds. But for things like the smaller tanks that you have to move the camera around quite a bit to see and right click, a bit nauseating to watch at high speed. So I'm just going to crossfade across now to the next part of the mission. So you see, the sun has now started to set. It took quite some time to get this thing refueled. We can now start backing up this truck to get the space plane to the end of the runway. And this is one of the reasons I didn't articulate the truck and its trailer. There is actually a rotor piece, not a rotor, a rotation servo. Is that what the piece is called? So the truck could, in theory, have an articulated trailer, much like how a real truck in the real world of this scale would have. The problem is that we have, well, the wheels of the trailer are powered. They're motorized, which means that you may have noticed there are far more wheels on the trailer than there are on the truck. So it's kind of this weird thing where actually the truck is not pulling the trailer is, if anything, pushing the truck. So if we were to have a hinge in between the trailer and the truck, the trailer would just continually push the truck off at a weird angle, and it wouldn't work very well. I tried just having it so only the truck's wheels were powered, but they just don't provide enough power to haul the immense weight of the trailer. There is a reason the trailer has to have that many wheels, because it is a very, very heavy thing. Granted, now that we have no fuel in it, it would be much lighter, and we probably could have disabled the motor power of the trailer and just use the truck, and then we could use the articulated feature. But I've only just thought of this now. I didn't think of this at the time. So maybe in a sequel, maybe I should have done that. I had everything I needed. It was all there. I just didn't think. But it doesn't matter, because the main focus of this video is the space plane. I have actually done similar refueling missions with space planes before, actually. My most popular video that features that refueling truck is the building a space station with an SSTO. So somewhat similar to this video, actually, where it's an SSTO that builds a space station, but rather than the SSTO just being the space station, it is just a cargo SSTO that lands at the runway, loads itself up with cargo, flies into space, deploys the cargo, goes back to the runway, refuels, picks up the next batch. It was a really cool video. Has been claimed by Word Chapel, so that I don't get any revenue from that video. But if you want to check it out anyway, you can. If I remember to put a link in the description, I might. But just give it a like if you do, or something like that, because I don't make money from that video, because I used a rap instrumental in the background. I think I used Dr. Dre's What's the Difference, if you know that song, and that got claimed. So I guess the audio claim is kind of legit, but it is at the same time like, come on guys, that was 20 seconds worth of a half an hour video. I feel like I deserve something, but all raps aside, doesn't matter. It's all in the past, water under the bridge. We're going to get as you can see, I played the footage back much faster for this ascent, because you guys have already seen the ascent of this SSTO. I feel like it wasn't that long ago when you watched the initial ascent of this thing, so I feel like I could just play the footage back much faster for the second ascension of this spacecraft. And then I realised our apoapsis is kind of at a good point where we can just do a mun burn straight away. We don't have to bother circularizing around Kerbin first, so we're going to just time warp up and execute the burn. It wasn't a very good mun encounter, you may have noticed on the map screen, although I did play the footage back quite fast again. It was a bit of a glitchy, not quite always permanent mun encounter. I think what happened was, it has happened again, like last episode, like last week or the week before, when I got an encounter with something and then it turned out that was actually on the second orbit. So it looks like we're getting into a mun encounter, but actually it's in like the second revolution of this orbit that we get that mun encounter, if that makes sense. If it doesn't make sense, you'll see it imminently what I mean. So maybe that's why it was so glitchy or whatever. So I'm just getting a nice, fairly low periapsis. I couldn't get it too low because it kept on like disappearing or glitching out. So I thought, let's just get it as low as we can. We're still not going very far from Kerbin, so we do have the Delta V to do lots of expensive inclination adjustments en route, so we can just do a radial in burn once we enter the mun's sphere of influence to get our periapsis nice and low, so we can get a good view of the lunar surface, or lunar surface I should say, from the observatory of the space station. And speaking of the space station, I think it's about time that we unpack it all again, so we can undock those docking ports and get this thing all unfolded once again. Another benefit to unfolding it is because I don't think this spacecraft actually features any RTGs or any solar panels aside from the big solar array on the space station. So by deploying it, we can also recharge the batteries inside the space plane. I didn't really feel like it would be too necessary to include external solar panels or, an RTG power source on the space plane itself, because whenever we need power, it's generally because we need to execute a maneuver node or a burn of some kind, and the nuclear engines have alternators inside them, so they just recharge batteries. So we can just use the nuclear engines if we ever need power in a pinch, and we can't unfold the solar panel array. Just a little additional note about the design of this thing. So we've done some science. Well, we're going to do some science once we get a little bit closer to the mun, actually. But look at that. I still can't get over how good that texture revamp looks. It looks so good now. The new mun texture. But yeah, it's definitely a different view to the view we had when we were low over Kerbin. So I wonder how different our scientific experiments will be. I've been to the mud on the save files. We're not actually getting many actual tangible science points, but again, we don't need them. We have a fully unlocked tech tree. It's more about the headcanon. I feel like that's the best way to have fun in this game. It's just make up your own little internal missions, internal storylines. That's kind of how Duna Attacks was. I've said this before, I think, but Duna Attacks kind of came from when I was playing Kerbal Space Program. I would just make up my own missions in my head and play along, and that was kind of my internal headcanon of a story mode for Kerbal Space Program. And then I just thought about making that a literal, well, not a literal reality, but, trying to make that an actual, like, it's visibly happening on screen, if that makes sense. If you guys have ever seen Duna Attacks, you probably have, actually, because it's one of the most popular videos on my channel. But that's kind of where the idea for Duna Attacks came from. And then Green Harvest and Expedition Eve were just sort of evolutions of that concept, really. But Duna Attacks was probably the closest to that particular concept of a Kerbal Space Program story mode. Expedition Eve and especially Green Harvest were very much machinimas, like they were just films made in the sandbox of Kerbal Space Program. This was kind of a weird divergence, wasn't it? We've done all of our missions around the Mun. We're going to get ready to set up a burn that will lower our orbit around Kerbin. I ideally want to get into a low equatorial orbit around Kerbin, first of all, rather than just going straight for our re-entry, just because re-entry from this height, things might get a little bit toasty. There's no ablative heat shields on this thing, but more importantly, I want to get back to the Kerbal Space Center runway. And whilst it is obviously very, very possible to get back to the runway from any orbital inclination with enough practice, it is just much easier to get it when you're in a low Kerbin orbit. And we have the Delta V, let's face it. How much Delta V do we have? Let me just blow up the screen a bit. 2097 is that? I'm trying to look at the... It is still very blurry. It's either 57 or 97. Regardless, it's a lot. It's more than enough for getting back to Kerbin from this height. So I didn't really mind spending a little bit of extra fuel just to make life a little bit easier for myself. And there we are. So obviously we're about to do the burn, so it was time to repack the space station into a more, a form factor that is more in line with our center of thrust to send things shattering and splintering with the thrust of those nuclear engines. And, well, there's the burn there. So I guess, I've already done a re-entry into Kerbin, and I've already kind of discussed, not only in this video, in fact, but just in a lot of my videos, the re-entry into Kerbin with an SSTO and aiming for the Kerbal Space Center runway. But I'll tell you what I haven't discussed ever on this channel. A Whisky review for Woodford Reserve. That's right, you thought they were gone? You thought I'd forgotten to put one in the Tylo Colony video? It's because I did forget to do a Whisky review on the Tylo Colony video, but do not worry. It's a good video, by the way, the Tylo Colony. If you want to watch it, you can just check that out. Maybe I'll put a link on screen just here. Anyway, we're going to do a Whisky review of Woodford Reserve. Straight bourbon whiskey. The art of making fine bourbon first took place on the site of the Woodford Reserve Distillery, a national historic landmark in 1812. The perfectly balanced taste of Kentucky straight bourbon whiskey from Woodford Reserve is comprised of more than 200 detectable flavor notes, from bold grain and wood to sweet aromatics, spice, and fruit and floral flavorings. But I must say that, Woodford Reserve, I really, really like it. It's not an expensive bourbon. You can often get it on sale for a mere £23-24 in the United Kingdom, and it is a wonderful whiskey, let me tell you. It is definitely an improvement over the more budgety ones like Jack Daniel's Old Number 7, which I've also reviewed on this Whisky Review channel. But the Woodford Reserve, it's very, very nice. It's got a nice sort of honey taste to it. It just glides down the throat with no real burn. It doesn't take your breath away like some of the more abrasive whiskies tend to. It just gives you a nice, warm, fuzzy feeling inside. And it has a nice it's a good sniffing whiskey as well. It's just nice to drink. It's very easy whiskey to drink, neat. And I can rarely make a bottle last more than like 3 days, if that's any good. So it's a good whiskey. And it has the street cred of being distilled on the Kentucky's oldest distillery site. Complex aromas of dried fruit, vanilla, tobacco spice, flavors of toffee and spice with a long, warming finish. Woodford Reserve, you are a good whiskey. And I would give you a solid 8 out of 10 for Woodford Reserve on today's Whisky Review. And it looks like I managed to wrap that up just in time for our landing of the Ssto. We have now touched back down on the runway. I'd call that mission a success, and I know you guys probably want to see how this thing works if we were to deploy it whilst landed. It doesn't work particularly well, but it does still work nonetheless. So there it is, unfolding just there. For me, it's currently Friday. It's March the 20th, and I'm still waiting for Animal Crossing New Horizons to arrive. Apparently it's going to arrive between 5 and 11 p.m. So hopefully it'll arrive as soon as I finish recording, so I can go and play that and escape to a wonderful little island where I can enjoy some more Woodford Reserve. But if you're stuck around waiting, maybe you could watch one of the things on screen. There's a link to my most recent upload on the right-hand side, and the left-hand side was a video chosen for you by YouTube's recommendation algorithm. There's also a link to subscribe and check out my Patreon if you would like to do so. And in the description you'll find links to Twitter, Discord, Instagram, all that good stuff. Guys, thank you so much for watching today's Whisky Review. I will see you in the next one.